Should you have a podcast, and is it difficult to run your own podcast? These are the two questions we're answering in this video. But to give you the short answer straight away, yes, you should have your own podcast. And no, it's not difficult. It's actually surprisingly easy to launch and run your very own podcast. However, I've had an over 2 hours long conversation with Nick Nalbach. He runs the 9-5 podcast, and he's also a podcasting coach and consultant. And he shared all the details, everything about podcasting, and that's what will be in the rest of this video. I think if you've ever considered podcasting, then this video will be well worth your time. You'll have all the answers that you need, and you will have a step-by-step plan, including Nick's instructions and best recommendations on how you can launch your podcast, run it, and also make money off of it. And my name is Morris. I run this YouTube channel, Create, Grow, Profit. And now let's dive into the interview with Nick. All right, so we're talking with Nick. He's a big podcaster. His show is called the 9-5 Podcast. And first, of course, we want to know, what is his show all about and how did he get into podcasting?
Yeah, so the whole idea behind the show was to kind of, in a way, chronicle my journey of escaping the 9 to 5 and building my own business. And in doing so, I'm interviewing entrepreneurs, business owners, the people that have been there, they've gone through that stage in life, and basically give both myself and the listeners an opportunity just to learn from them. Like, what experiences do they have through that whole process? What has helped their business grow? And it's pretty wild, like how many amazing people are out there just absolutely crushing it that you may have never heard of. And hearing those stories and the insecurities and the feelings and emotions that they went through that whole process is just like everyone else.
Nick's podcast revolves around inviting guests and interviewing them. But for example, this video that you're watching right now, this is edited afterwards. I'm cutting together his answers, I'm recording myself to guide you through his answers. But the way he does it is that he does it all live, and he just has a conversation with people, records it, and that makes a new podcast episode.
I'll give you a good example here. Before I launched my podcast, I was listening to Pat Flynn, the Smart Passive Income podcast, and I was obsessed with the podcast. Like, I idolized Pat Flynn. I was like, holy cow, like, this is so cool. The stories he brings out, like, everything is so awesome. Like, eventually I want to start a podcast. Well, a few months into launching my show, I got Pat on the podcast, and it was like such a holy crap moment. Like,
so Nick was able to bring one of his idols as a guest into his podcast, and this is only possible because he had the courage to ask people to be their guests. And this is something he highlighted with me several times, where he kept saying, look, you just need to have the courage to ask people to be your guests, have the courage to ask people if you can interview them on a topic, and then you can start podcasting and recording your episodes. There are many advantages to doing this type of format.
It's me just having a conversation with other people. So if you can break it down to where it's just a conversation, it's just two people having a chat about a common, like, interest, it becomes so much easier. It's so much easier. I know the big fear with bringing a guest on is that you're not going to know the right questions to ask, or you're just going to kind of get stumped, and maybe you look like a fool in front of this other person, or whatever all these fears are with having a guest. But I've done very little just solo episodes of me talking, and I feel like that is so much more difficult for me to just talk for 45 minutes to an hour versus being able to bring someone on and have just like a real conversation with someone. Well, and you get to leverage the stories of the guests. Like, that's what makes podcasting so powerful, are the stories. And as one human being, like, yeah, you experience a lot, but to like tap into some of those stories and experiences can be difficult. And to try to put it down into something uniform that makes sense and it's cohesive and just has a nice flow to it can be very difficult, especially at the beginning. But being able to lean on people who have those stories to share and those experiences that you might not have, you can uncover a lot of really cool stuff with a guest, understand and hear their stories and all the experiences they went through, and just be like, man, a few years ago, that person was in the exact seat that I'm in right now. And now they're making 7 figures, 8 figures, like they're crushing it.
Clearly, Nick is very passionate about his podcast and podcasting in general. But what are some of the reasons why people start a podcast, and what are good reasons to start a podcast?
I think at the base, like very high level, people think I have a lot to say, I should start a podcast. Or you have a group of friends that are sitting around, they're goofing off, they're telling crazy stories, and like, oh, dude, you know what? We should start a podcast. This would be so funny. But that's, I don't know, at a very high level, it's not the right step. Like, yes, it's great. You definitely have something to share. You definitely have great stories that people can benefit from. But if you just go into it thinking like, you know what, I'm going to start a podcast and let's see what happens. Like, part of that I agree with, because that's kind of what I did. But now looking back on it, I wish I would have been more intentional with starting the show and really dove into the why of it. Because being a year and a half, almost 2 years into the podcast now, I'm thinking about that stuff and I'm like, wow, like I can totally reshape and provide real value to people if I had just thought about that a little bit earlier. Like, I have all these episodes now. Like, I feel like I'd be in a lot better place than I am right now. And yeah, I think a lot of people get started because they either think like, I have a lot to say, so I want to start a podcast, or they think that they're going to build some massive audience from the podcast. They're going to be the next Joe Rogan podcast and they're going to sign $1 million deals. And that's usually not the case. That's very rare. Thinking about it now, I'd be willing to bet that majority kind of fall in that, like, they think that you can make a lot of money from podcasting. Like, you're going to get the big sponsorship deals. You're going to start bringing in all this money from the podcast alone. And majority of the podcasters that I talk to, the podcast is not a direct flow of cash, at least in any like decent sized percentage of their overall revenue. Usually they're using the podcast as a platform to direct people to other offerings, products, courses, whatever it is. And it's kind of like an indirect way to bring in money.
Talking about money, how does someone make money with a podcast, and how much money can you make with a podcast?
There's a bunch of different ways to actually go about monetizing the podcast itself, whether that's through like the sponsorship ads that I just mentioned. Usually those don't amount to a whole lot. I've heard of some podcasters working out like actual sponsorship packages where you're no longer thinking about your podcast as just a podcast. You're almost thinking about it in terms of like, you are a like marketing agency, and someone who comes to you that wants to like sponsor the show is going to get this whole suite of media options where they're going to get 30-second ads on your show. They're going to get Instagram, YouTube, Facebook coverage, however you want to work out that package. And usually that's a little bit more lucrative way, because if you think of how much money people are spending on advertising through Facebook, Instagram ads, like all of that stuff, if they're going to pay you a couple grand to basically promote their stuff, that's going to be a way cheaper option than pumping thousands and thousands of dollars into something like Facebook ads. And with podcasting, typically you're able to reach your targeted audience.
If you're running an online business, eventually you will be faced with the topic of content marketing. But with so many content types out there nowadays, we have video, we have text, we have images, and now there's podcasting. Compared to all the other content types, what are the advantages of running a podcast? And in which areas does podcasting even win over the other content channels?
Podcasting gives you a lot more trust and credibility. It's very similar to video content. You can build a lot more trust with your audience through that kind of content. They're hearing your voice. If you choose to add video to it, they're seeing you. You're just kind of able to build that credibility that it can be very difficult in text. If you are going to, let's say, run a course on the side, people might have already been listening to your podcast for a while now, and they're like, well, this guy knows what he's talking about, or this girl knows what she's talking about. Like, this is the next step I want to do. So yes, I'm going to purchase this course or become this person's client or buy this product, whatever it is. But the podcast is kind of what gets you in the door to build that trust and credibility that I feel like can be very difficult to find elsewhere.
So Nick gave the example of selling an online course with the help of a podcast. And I think selling a course is something that interests many of us. So I wanted to know from him in more detail, how exactly can we sell our very own online course through a podcast?
It's just like any other sales tactic in a way. They talk about like if you are trying to introduce your brand and build brand awareness, they need to see your brand 5, 6, 7 times before they'd feel at all comfortable making a purchase. But the listener retention on podcasts is so much higher than any other medium. And if someone is listening to your podcast week after week or day after day, whatever your frequency is, like you are getting all those touch points. They're seeing exactly who they are. And if they stick around that long, they obviously enjoy the way you tell the stories, the way you teach the content or share the content. And they're going to be a lot more likely to buy with a lot of the podcasters that I've interviewed on the show or have spoken to. The stuff that they offer is basically what they talk about on the podcast. And they end up building fans of the podcast. And then they're obviously following them for a reason, whether they're teaching about a specific topic or whatever it is. They're obviously interested in learning that. Otherwise, they wouldn't stick around. And then they come in and say, hey, by the way, I have this course or this digital product that can help you along the way. Like they're already a fan of you at that point. Like they're going to grab whatever you're throwing at them because they're there for that reason. And now you're giving them even more of a reason to buy your product. If you're coming from like an educational standpoint, if your podcast is very educational, they're kind of getting an idea of how you teach things, like how you teach a specific topic or how you go about explaining things. And like I mentioned before, they're kind of sticking around the podcast because they like the way that you're doing things. So if they're liking the way that you're teaching these various topics that you're discussing in the episodes, they're likely going to like and appreciate the way that you're actually teaching in your courses. I think a lot of people that are hesitant about buying online courses, it's because they are either unsure or the way someone teaches isn't quite in line with what they're looking for. Because you and I could both teach the same exact course, and we're going to teach it just a little bit differently. And some people are going to resonate with how you teach it and explain it, and some people are going to resonate with how I teach it and explain it. But it's just all about that alignment. And if, like I mentioned before, if they are sticking around with your podcast and following you around every single week, they're doing that for a reason. They're doing it because they like the way you're doing something. So I almost think selling a course at that point becomes easy.
As I was listening to Nick explain all these advantages and unique aspects of podcasting, I slowly started to realize that really the key element to the success of podcasting as a medium is the listener retention. Retention just means how long does someone stick around on average. You could also say it means how long someone gives you their attention. And almost anywhere on the internet it's pretty much a battlefield, if not a war. Whoever can grab the other people's attention, make them listen, watch, consume your content, those are the types of businesses who will usually succeed. Now with podcasting, and compared to all the other channels and platforms out there, podcasting grabs the listener's attention for much longer on average. And this is really the power of podcasting for us as marketers and for us as a communication tool with our audience, clients, and potential buyers.
Social media content, like ads, you only have so much time to hook them in. And if you don't hook them in, they're gone. Just like that. And even if you do get them to click on the video and start watching, keeping them engaged with that video for 10, 15, 20 minutes is extremely difficult to do. With podcasts, they're so much easier to consume than any other content. You don't have to sit there and read. You don't have to sit there and watch. You can literally turn it on while you're at the gym, you're in the car, you're going for a walk, like whatever you're doing, you can consume it pretty much doing anything. And that makes, I think, podcasting super powerful for one. And two, as long as people are enjoying the podcast, they're likely not going to stick around for the first 5-10 minutes and then bounce, unless the episode just wasn't for them. Usually they're going to stick through the entire episode and listen to every single word. Even if they're not actively listening, like they're going to be passively listening to some extent. No other platform gives you that person's attention for that long.
Your audience retention is one very important metric for content marketing, but now let's talk about another crucial metric, and that is competition. What is the competition in podcasting? And I think this metric here will blow your mind because it really did surprise me of how little competition there still is in podcasting, even though it seems like there are so many podcasts out there.
Yeah, so I actually did a podcast episode. It was just me sharing why I think podcasting should be a part of your strategy. And if you go to episode 78 of the 9-5 podcast, I lay out a lot of crazy statistics about podcasting, kind of where it's at and where it's going. This is a stat that I did talk about on the podcast, that episode. As of 2021, there are over 2.4 million podcasts, which sounds like a lot. Everyone says like, oh, everyone's got a podcast. Like maybe I should start my own podcast. Like maybe that's another reason why people start podcasts, because like everyone's got one, I should have one. But out of those 2.4 million, only 23% are active. So only about 550 podcasts are active. And by active, that means they published an episode in the last 90 days. So when you look at the scale of YouTube, there's probably more by now, just in a few months, but were over 37 million YouTube channels and only 500,000 active podcasts. So I kind of equate this to TikTok and Instagram. Like everyone was jumping on Instagram because they're like, oh my gosh, the growth potential is insane with TikTok because the content's getting pushed out. It's new. People are trying to get on board. Podcasting, yes, it seems like it's been around a long time and it seems like everybody has one, but people aren't taking it seriously. So that potential that's there is still massive. Like if you're going to tell me if you could have been one of the first like 500,000 people in YouTube, you wouldn't try to take those odds. And podcasting continues to grow every single year. It's just getting more popular and more people are finding them, figuring out the medium. Like it's just new right now, but the potential that's there is insane.
Nick mentioned episode 78 in his podcast. I listened to that episode and that's where he shares a lot of eye-opening stats around podcasting, the potential of podcasting, and its marketing power. I highly recommend that you listen to that episode as well. It's very insightful and I'll be linking to that episode directly in the description below this video. I think if you've made it this far in the video, then you're starting to become motivated to start your own podcast. At least that's how it was for me, listening to Nick, talking to him and learning all these details. And one worry for me was always the time involved with recording the podcast episodes and editing them. So the question is, how time consuming is it to run a podcast?
I personally think editing for YouTube and creating YouTube content is way more difficult than doing a podcast. So I don't know. Podcasting isn't going anywhere. Like that's for sure. The amount of listeners that keep coming on board every year continues to grow. So I think now is the best time to get in if yesterday wasn't already. It's just like anything else. I mean, you can make it as easy or as complicated as you want. There is all kinds of equipment that you can get that I couldn't even tell you how to piece together. And it's very complicated. Like I think of like radio studios, like all the wires and mixing boards and like all that stuff, but you don't have to be that complicated. And most people aren't that complicated with it. You could literally start a podcast with your phone right now. Just record everything on the phone, upload it to Anchor, which is a free hosting platform that pushes it out to all the different like podcast apps, Spotify, Apple, all of that. And that's it. Your podcast is done. Like it can be super cheap, super easy. And I think everyone kind of gets hung up with, they'll start looking up, oh, I need a good microphone. Like it's going to enhance the quality of your show. Yes. But do you need one? No. And do you need an expensive one? Absolutely not. This microphone that I'm talking on right now is, I think it's $65 on Amazon right now. And I've used this from the beginning. And you can buy like a whole podcasting kit that comes with like the boom arm, headphones, pop filter, like all this stuff that you're like, I need all this different equipment in order to have a podcast. They literally sell it to you in a bundle for like $100. I like to make it as easy as possible for everybody while still creating the most high quality podcast we can make, because it really doesn't have to take much.
I think so far podcasting sounds very accessible. It's not expensive, and hardware isn't anything that would stop us from, at the very least, launch our podcast and start recording episodes. However, what about podcasting skills? For example, talking on camera, it took me a while to do that. And how is it with podcasting? Is there anything special, any special skills or talents that are required, or skills that we must learn before we can start recording and uploading and spreading the word about our podcast?
If you've talked on the phone before, like that is essentially all you need to be able to do to run a podcast, because you literally just pull up your phone, like open up the voice recorder or the Anchor app or wherever you want to do it, say what you're going to say, talk for 15 minutes on a topic that you enjoy, and then send, upload, done.
That was my reaction in the conversation with Nick, because at that point, if I can run an entire podcast just by talking into my phone and uploading the recordings, then pretty much any excuse is gone to not launch my own podcast. But I would have never expected that recording and uploading podcasting episodes can be that simple. But of course, we don't want to talk to nobody. We want people to actually listen to our podcasts. So how difficult is it to get thousands of listeners on our podcast?
I recently kind of had a revelation about, because I kind of went with the whole, like, I want to start a podcast. I don't really know the direction of it. I'm just going to interview people. I know I want to interview entrepreneurs and share their stories, and that's all I know about it. Hopefully help people along the way. And that's exactly how I started. I just went for it, started doing it. And as I'm thinking about it more, it is, to be successful with it and to build an audience that really cares what you have to say, you need to be you have to think a lot about your why. Like, why am I really doing this podcast? And I'm talking like, think deeper than like, because I want to make money from it. Like, what is the purpose of the show? How are you going to help someone? How is someone going to be entertained or get educated from your show? What kind of information are they looking for? Like, really understanding your why, the target audience. Those are like the two big things. If you can start answering those questions and think deeply about it, everything kind of becomes easier. And you start thinking about, it's not going to be like, well, what kind of content should I create? It's, okay, what kind of content does my audience want from me?
So we hear that a lot in content marketing, creating what your audience wants to hear, talking about the topics that your audience cares about and answering their questions. But oftentimes it's difficult to do this, to actually sit down and create content that answers your audience's questions. Thankfully, Nick has a step-by-step process, and he explained that to me as well. So maybe here you want to write down some notes. This is incredibly valuable. Here's Nick sharing his process to creating valuable content for his podcast that attracts many listeners.
There are a list of 7 questions that I like to go through. And like I said, the idea of this came about well after I had already started the podcast. And I think that these questions really, they pertain to not only your episodes, but your podcast as a whole, your brand as a whole. Like, you can think of these questions at every level of your business, and it will help basically shape everything about your business. This is kind of based off of like the hero's journey. So you want to be taking your listeners or your clients or whatever, you want to be taking them through a journey. So that's kind of where some of the terminology and the verbiage come in here. But that first question is, who is the character? So in this story of your brand or your episode or your blog, whatever it is, who is the main character of that story? And what do they want? That's question number 2. What do they want? Then we get to question 3. Why can't they get what they want? What are the pain points that are holding them back from actually achieving that? Is that something where they just don't have the information? They've tried all these different marketing tactics and strategies, and nothing clicked, nothing worked for them. What's actually holding them back from achieving it? Then question number 4 is, what are the stakes? What will happen if they don't get what they want? So I like to think about this when I plan out my episodes. It's like, okay, the person that's listening to this episode, they're the main character of it. And this is what they want out of this episode. This is what they're going to want from this guest. And if they don't get this, they are either going to, their marketing is going to fail, their social media is going to, like, no one's going to read, they're not going to reach anyone with social media. No one's going to listen to their podcast episodes. Like, these are the types of things you need to be thinking about that people would be afraid of if they don't actually achieve what they want, because those fears are real. That's something that people, even if they're not consciously thinking about, they're subconsciously thinking about, like, oh gosh, if this YouTube channel doesn't take off, like, how am I going to get clients? Like, I'm not going to get anybody coming in. So thinking about those fears, that's a huge trigger for anyone who's either coming to your brand or coming to your podcast episode, because they're like, yeah, I understand that and I don't want that. So I need to listen to this episode or go see what Morris is talking about on his YouTube channel. Then we get into question number 5, who or what helps them? Now, that could be your course, that could be your podcast episode, that could be the guests that you bring on the podcast, but who or what is going to help them achieve what they want to achieve? And then question number 6 is, how do they get what they want? So likely with a guest that you bring on, it's going to be like a series of steps, or like when we uncover like what got the guest to the point that they're at now, there was like a series of events that happened that led them to where they're at. And by them successfully completing each one of these steps, that's what ultimately led to that success. So we're kind of breaking it down, like how it's going to work, or if it's a course, like what is going to happen in this course? What do the modules look like? Or what are you going to learn in this course that's going to get you to where you need to be? And then question number 7, by far my favorite question, is, what is the transformation? What is it going to look like after they've done this, after they listen to the episode, after they've taken the course, watched the video? Like, what are they going to gain from that? And hopefully that is going to be what they wanted. If everything's all in alignment, you already know what they want. Now you just have to figure out how you're going to get them there. And that should be the transformation. They leave this video and they know, hopefully they want to start a podcast, because podcasting is freaking sweet. You always hear about people talking about messaging and branding and making sure your messaging is on point. And it was like, yeah, I get that. It makes sense, but I don't know how to do it. And once I started using these questions, it was like, oh, like that's what everyone's talking about. That's what they mean. Like, this all of a sudden went from being unfathomable to like super easy. Like, this got way too simple, way too fast. But it took a long time to actually find those questions and come up with that. I literally have this on a page. Like, every time I create a new podcast, those questions are right there, and I make myself fill it out before I even go in to record the episode, just because I think it's that important, and keeping that top of mind. Otherwise, who knows where your episode or YouTube video, wherever, is going to go.
So when you're ready to record your very first podcast episode, all you have to do now is write down these 7 questions that Nick just gave to us, and then answer all these 7 questions. And answering them, that is your podcast episode. Because these questions are so helpful and so valuable, I'll summarize them, list them on my website in a separate blog post. If you want to see those questions and just copy paste them into your notes, click the link below this video in the description. It'll take you to the blog post, and there you'll have a summary of these questions. And also, thank you, Nick, for sharing your secret with us here. This is really, really helpful. So at this point in my conversation with Nick, I have learned a lot of things about podcasting, and he answered many of my questions. And most importantly, now I know how to record a podcast episode, that I know that I can use my phone. The tech isn't an issue. And also I know what to say now in a podcast episode. I either invite a guest and I interview them, or I can record myself talking for 5 minutes, 10 minutes, and all I have to do is answer the 7 questions he's just given us. However, there was still one question on my mind, and that is, how long should a podcast episode be? For how long do I have to speak so that it's a good episode?
Very interesting, because right when I stepped in, like, the most popular podcasts were the ones that were 60 minutes long. Those are always the ones that I listen to. Now they're kind of, people's attention spans are adjusting to that. I think the shorter episodes are starting to do a little bit better, kind of in the 20 to 30 minute range. The time, or I guess the average episode durations, I think the most popular episode duration right now is still within that like 30 to 45 minute range. So it's still a decent amount of time, but it's significantly shorter than it has been in the past. You start with whatever you're comfortable with. Like if you're terrified to get on the microphone or be in front of a camera, like by all means, like start with 5 minutes. There are 5-minute podcasts out there, and like 5-minute daily dose or something like that, where you're just getting comfortable on camera, and then you can kind of gauge the audience at that point, because you'll likely be building an audience, and just kind of say, hey guys, like I'm really interested to know, like, would you enjoy longer versions of this episode?
I guess that answer was kind of to be expected, but it was very comforting for me at least that, yeah, there is a trend towards what kind of episode lengths are very common out there. But for us, as launching and getting started, we can record as short or as long of episodes as we feel most comfortable with. Now, another thing that really helps, of course, is editing. And editing is probably something where it sounds like that is going to be complicated as well. But just telling from my experience, cutting out things that we don't want to say or cutting out silences is very easy with post-production, with any type of editing software. And so I asked Nick what he recommends, and here's his answer.
I would recommend in some sort of editing software. For Mac users, GarageBand is perfectly suitable. For PC users, Audacity is very popular. Both are free platforms. I personally use Adobe Audition, but I'm very much like baked into the Adobe suite, so it makes sense for me. Basically, what you do is you drag in that audio file that you've created, and you can go chop it up, pull out all of the unnecessary ums or the screw ups or whatever you want out of that audio. I tend to, when I talk, I'll leave like really awkward silences. At least to me, they sound very awkward. Where I'll be thinking about the next thing that I want to say, and like when I listen back to it, I'm like, this does not sound natural at all. So there's actually tools that like help you remove all of that. So I'll go in, clean it up, get rid of some stuff. Maybe we screwed up or we had to rephrase a question or something like that, like chop those areas out. And it's just as simple as like clicking where you want to chop it, click where you want to chop it, delete. Get the episode sounding and looking how you want, no screw ups in it, and then you just export it as an MP3 file.
But once the episode is edited, we still need to upload the MP3 file to all the various podcasting platforms so it's online and people can start listening to it.
And then once you have that exported, you upload it. So wherever it's a podcast host, they're the ones that will distribute the podcast to all of the podcasting apps. So your Spotify, your Apple, Stitcher, wherever you listen to podcasts, they take care of all that for you. Literally all you have to do is upload the MP3 file to them and they're like, done. Starting out, something free like Anchor definitely work. If this is something that you're serious about, I would recommend just jumping straight to something like Buzzsprout or Libsyn or Captivate. There's a bunch of different ones out there, but really it just depends on if you're just trying it out or if this is something that you really want to take seriously.
We now have all the information to record a podcast, make interesting podcast episodes, upload it, edit it, everything, the whole thing. Nick explained it all to us. But of course, there is still one step that is very important, and that is actually doing it. It takes some courage, and Nick shared some very encouraging words with me in our conversation. Here's what he said.
All the podcasters that I've talked to, when I asked them like, what was that experience like getting started, they're like, it was terrifying. It was so nervous, like hearing my voice. I hate the way my voice sounds. That's like the most common thing. And like just kind of almost freaking out about it. But like anything you do, it's going to take repetition. I like to talk about like when you're kids, you do things without even thinking about it and you suck at them, but you keep doing them. And over the years you get better at it. And then that kind of becomes your thing. Like, so maybe when I was younger, like I grew up playing baseball. I'm sure the first time I picked up a baseball bat, I absolutely sucked. I probably couldn't hit the damn thing. And then as I got like more practice in, I got better and better and better until I was playing in high school and college and all that. It's the same thing with everything else we're doing in an adult life, only when we're adults, we're like so much more self-conscious of what we're doing. So think of your kid or you as a child picking up a podcast mic and trying to do a podcast episode. It's gonna suck. My first episodes are like cringy to listen to, and they're still up. So if anybody wants to listen to them, like go listen to them like then and now, and they sound completely different. And it's just that repetition of being more comfortable with doing it.
I know it's easier said than done, but even if it feels slightly terrifying to start your own podcast and record yourself, I hope Nick's words give you some encouragement and make you just get up and do it and have some fun with it. Of course, Nick has also created very helpful resources for podcasters, particularly one checklist that I've downloaded as well, and I find it very helpful. He created a checklist of everything that you need to do to set up your podcast properly and launch it with the highest chance of success.
In that checklist, I basically go through the exact blueprint for what I did to launch my podcast. And something that we didn't actually touch on in this episode, but to kind of help build hype for the show, is creating a launch group or simply a Facebook group that you can invite people into, make them kind of build it with you. Then they become a little bit more invested in it. And they're like, we helped come to this, like we helped Nick get started. We helped shape the podcast into what it is. But aside from that, we hit like everything that's in that checklist. But like I said, it takes you through the exact steps that I went through to launch the show. Everything that I've done, like I did the research, I went through the steps, like the exact steps that are in there. So I think if you do follow those steps and you take it seriously and commit to them, you will have no problem launching your podcast. Your podcast is launched, it's on Apple, it's on Spotify, it's everywhere. And then you just wait to get feedback and have fun with it.
You can download this checklist for free from Nick's website, and of course, you will find the link in the description below this video as well. Just click that link, it'll take you directly to the download page for this free checklist. And finally, if you would like to reach out to Nick directly, of course you can do that as well. I'll put his contact details below this video too. And this is what he has to say for anyone who would like to talk to him directly.
If podcasting is what you want to do, if any of the things that we talked about today, if it's just like it's not clicking, or you have more questions or just need more help and you want that one-on-one kind of like hand-holding through this entire launch process, we can hop on a phone call. We'll kind of develop and flesh out what that podcast is going to look like, what the episodes are going to look like. We'll get into the tech, like all of this stuff, any of fears that you have that are potentially holding you back. We're going to kind of unpack a lot of that. And then I think it's going to be about an 8-week program for anyone who wants to work one-on-one with me. And we're going to literally like sit down one-on-one every single week, and we're going to knock out different steps of launching this podcast, whether that's recording, setting up and recording your mic, learning how to edit the podcast, setting up that launch team, like all of these things. Like I'm going to be right there with you every step of the way, all the way up until launch, and even planning for the future beyond the launch. So if that is anything that you are interested in, by all means, let's hop on a call and talk about your new show.
That was Nick from the 9-5 podcast. This was one of the most educational conversations I've had, and I can't believe how generous Nick was by sharing all his knowledge, his secrets, his insights. And I honestly feel like that after watching this video, that anyone could record, edit, upload, distribute, and just launch their podcast. So to put this theory to the test, I'll record one podcast episode following all the steps that Nick taught us here in this video. And I'll be recording myself as I go through the process, so you get a little behind the scenes look. Once that video is done, then you can click here and you will be able to watch that follow-up video where I follow Nick's steps and implement what he taught us here today. Thank you so much for watching, and thank you for sticking until the end. My name is Morris, and I will see you in the next video.